Our next guest is author and journalist Alex Berenson, who was kicked off Twitter but successfully won his case to be allowed back on. Something of a pioneer. We did a presentation on this matter, didn't we, Gareth?
Yes.
And have we put that up yet?
Yeah, it was up this week.
Yeah, it was up. It's a brilliant little presentation where we show that Scott Gottlieb, the sort of Eddie Munster-looking figure who campaigned to have people kicked off of Twitter for talking about natural immunity. That's an image of Scott Gottlieb there. He's a Pfizer executive and a social media campaigner, and he regarded Alex Berenson as his nemesis. That's Alex. Hello, thanks for joining us, mate.
Thanks for having me, Russell.
Well done for being the first person to be able to traverse that threshold of being allowed back on Twitter. It's an extraordinary accomplishment in itself.
Yeah, I got a judge in San Francisco, believe it or not, who was willing to look at the facts of the case and what Twitter had, sort of told me, senior Twitter executive in 2020 when things were not quite so polarized on social media and Twitter really was more of was in favor of free speech in the way it had always said it was. He told me, hey, we like debate. And so with those assurances, I went out and said a lot of stuff that I certainly think has turned out to be correct about the uselessness of lockdowns and uselessness of masks and the uselessness of school closures, all this stuff in 2020. And then in 2021, started raising questions about the vaccines. And of course, by that point, the powers that be really didn't want debate about the mRNA vaccines. And so in the summer of 2021, Twitter kicked me off, but I did sue. And, I had this judge who was sort of willing to look at the whole spectrum of what Twitter had provided me in terms of assurances. And he allowed the case to move forward. And that essentially forced Twitter, this is before Elon took over, forced Twitter to settle and put me back on.
It's an interesting precedent, and it's probably very important that the success that you have had with that being reinstated is a kind of a benchmark. We have comparable challenges on some of the platforms that we broadcast on, where, of course, you'll be aware that the WHO set the community guidelines, for example, on YouTube, meaning that we are unable to frame the debate in the balanced way that we would like to. Around the time that you were kicked off, Scott Gottlieb, the Pfizer executive, he regarded you as something of a thorn in his side. He successfully had a former FDA head tweet about natural immunity and its potential efficacy removed from Twitter. How did you feel about that whole period? And what do you think? What does it suggest when Pfizer have that much influence on a social media platform?
I mean, it's obviously problematic, and Scott Gottlieb, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, is more than just a Pfizer board executive. He was the head of the FDA in the United States from 2017 to 2019. He quit the FDA, and 3 months later, he joined the board of one of the world's largest drug companies. And that, in and of itself, is hugely problematic. I mean, that shouldn't happen. That's the revolving door. That's a guy who goes from a government job to a board position at a drug company where he's meeting a few times a year and he's making more money doing that than he did for his, government job. And that to me is a big problem. But so Scott Gottlieb, was very connected to, obviously he was connected to Pfizer, but he was also connected to people inside the government during the Trump administration, but also during the Biden administration. So Pfizer and the White House were clearly working closely to message about the vaccines in late 2020, early 2021. And as the vaccines started to run into problems in the summer of 2021, and it became clear to these people that they were going to have to push for boosters, they're going to have to push for vaccine mandates. I think we're already seeing evidence that there was a concerted effort to message. It's for the government to put out heavy spin, the federal government, and to censor critics. And, I was certainly one of the more prominent critics of what was happening. And I think, unfortunately, Russell, I mean, this is all very, very important, the social media piece of this. But what's even more important, or what's as important, is that the strategy has failed. The boosters have failed. People continue to catch COVID. Older people especially continue to die from COVID and Omicron. What we've done is we've given a lot of people at tremendous expense and risk to their long-term health, quote unquote vaccines that, didn't provide any long-term immunity from COVID at all. And I think it's like, I want to talk about the censorship because I think that's incredibly important, but I also think we should not forget what's happened, which is that those of us who warned in the summer of 2021, there's a problem here. These vaccines don't seem to be working as promised, have been proven completely correct.
Alex, you're quite right. We sometimes forget the significance of the framing that you've just offered. It seems difficult, even for the most ardent critics of what happened in the last couple of years, to maintain sight of how significant what happened was. The way that information moves, the pace of change, the invitation to migrate to different issues, the kind of dismissiveness and the inherent nihilism that having access to information so quickly kind of generates makes it difficult. What's your most optimistic appraisal of what's just happened? Do you put this down to ineptitude, corruption? How far are you willing to go, and how far do we need to go? And how do you think it's best to present this? What do you think are the most salient points to focus people on if you want to galvanize opposition and generate some hope that this kind of thing can be prevented in the future?
Most optimistic view of what happened is that there was a real hope that this mRNA technology was a true breakthrough, a true biological breakthrough, that it was going to enable people to have a really powerful, robust immune response to the coronavirus. And we were going to be able to do something that we really had never been able to do before, which was stop a respiratory virus. And that when the results came out in November 2020, look, I was optimistic too. I mean, there was this brief period before I'd really seen what they'd done with the trials and how they'd designed the trials essentially so the trials were very unlikely to fail. That I thought, hey, this could work. This could get us out of this. And then what happened was in the spring of 2021, after the first wave of immunizations in the U.S., in the U.K., and especially in Israel. Israel, it's a small country, has a good healthcare system. They immunized almost everybody very quickly. There was this period in April and May of 2021 when deaths went, well, not just deaths, but cases went way, way down. And I think they just got overly optimistic, and they didn't realize that they hadn't actually done what they thought they'd done. And so they were caught completely flat-footed in July of 2021 when cases started to go back up. Now, you can say that they should have been more cautious. I mean, I'm not just going to say you can say that. They should have been far more cautious than they were. But the most optimistic view of this is that it's not some crazy, it's not depopulation, it's not even corruption or money hunger. It's just that they got too optimistic. They, the joke, right? Never get high on your own supply. They got high on their own supply, and you can tell that that's true because they all got vaccinated. All those people, unless you want to believe, the true conspiracy theories that they were getting saline, which is not true, they all got vaccinated early. This is my joke about this is not really a joke. This is the only experimental medical product in history where rich white people demanded that they get it first, right? They didn't want to wait. They didn't want it to be tried in Africa first. They wanted it right away. And that tells you that they believed.
Yeah, that's also an interesting aspect of this. When we look back over the last couple of years, there are significant figures that were, in retrospect, perhaps unduly lionized. The now departed former head of the NIH, Anthony Fauci, perhaps stands head and shoulders above everyone else as the main mouthpiece, advocate, and figure of authority who, particularly while the Trump administration was still in play, was regarded as a counter-narrative voice and a sort of almost a righteous patriarch. We're, of course, excited to learn if you have any revelations about the Fauci files, any potential releases, and how you think that Anthony Fauci will be represented within them.
So unfortunately, Elon is mad at me again. Elon has blocked me on Twitter again. And this has nothing to do with the substance of my drop from the Twitter files. which came out a couple of weeks ago, which, as you mentioned, had to do with Scott Gottlieb and how Gottlieb, tried to get voices, not just me, but other voices that he didn't like censored. Elon got upset because I didn't put the whole story on Twitter first. I linked to my Substack. It sounds pretty technical and silly, and it kind of is. But I thought we had an agreement that I was going to do it that way. He didn't think so, so he's upset with me. So I'm out of the Twitter files again. Maybe that'll change. Look, let me pull back for just a second before I answer the question specifically about Fauci. Elon Musk has provided an enormous service, okay, by opening these files. And the most important thing to me that's come out so far isn't what I wrote. It's actually about the FBI and the fact that the FBI was pushing Twitter to censor individual tweets. I mean, I think that's an absolutely insane overreach by the FBI. They're a law enforcement agency. They're not in the censorship business. Whether it was illegal, it certainly wasn't in keeping with their mission. And Elon has done this at risk to himself, okay? In opening these files, he's opening Twitter to more litigation. And ultimately, even if the people who are being sued, are before he took over, because he owns the company now, he in some way is going to be responsible for that. And he knows that, okay? He knows it. He knows the chance that he's taking, and he's doing it because he thinks it's really important. And he deserves credit for that. And, whether or not I ever talk to the guy again, I'm going to say that forever. Okay. The problem is, in terms of Fauci specifically, I don't know what's in there about Fauci. Obviously, Fauci's name comes up in Twitter a lot, but whether there's evidence that he directly or even provably indirectly was manipulating, was trying to censor in the way we know other people were, I don't know that we have that. I never saw anything like that. And I will say this, Anthony Fauci is very, very careful about what he says, right? You don't survive in Washington for 50 years unless you're really good at this game. And when he was deposed, meaning he had to testify under oath or give answers to questions under oath back in November in a lawsuit that Missouri had brought against social media company or against him and other people, he said clearly, and he said, I don't recall to a lot of things, but not to this question. He said he had not been in touch with Twitter directly. I'm pretty sure he said that. I have to go back and look at the transcript, but I'm pretty sure that's what he said. So for him to say that with that level of confidence, to me, means that he probably doesn't think there's anything, really bad that in those Twitter files. And so I think we're a little bit over-focused on Fauci. I agree with you. He was the center of everything. He became this, heroic anti-Trump figure in a lot of the media. But in terms of his specific efforts to censor social media, I think Anthony Fauci let other people inside the federal government do that for him. And I suspect that's what the files are going to show. So I think people are looking for some revelation that Anthony Fauci called Jack Dorsey and said, get Alex Berenson off, or get all the comments from Russell Brand off, or whatever it is. That's not going to be there.
We had David Sirota from The Lever on the show yesterday. He's got a story about Pfizer paying to remove negative media coverage, not specifically related to this matter. I don't believe. Oh, no, yeah, no, it is. I wonder, Alex, if you have any thoughts on that or experience around that story.
So, I mean, here's what I think. I think it's crazy that the left has become the best friend of Big Pharma. I mean, that's not the history of big pharmaceutical companies and people on the left. There's the most famous, incident in the last 25 years is actually involving Pfizer, where a bunch of kids in Nigeria got meningitis and died in a Pfizer clinical trial that was very ethically problematic and became essentially the kernel for the book The Constant Gardener, that famous John le Carré book that got turned into a great movie with Rachel Weisz. And that's what the left thought of Pfizer, that they would literally, or not Pfizer, but big pharma in general, that they would literally let poor kids die in drug trials. And whether that's true or not, that certainly was the way the left viewed them. And suddenly Pfizer can do no wrong. These vaccines are perfect. I don't understand how the left has lost its skepticism around pharma.
What seems extraordinary, Alex, is since essentially the establishment and the left's interests have aligned, or even perhaps the left isn't the correct term, the liberal establishment and the left have sort of migrated to talking primarily about cultural issues, because when it comes to matters of power and finance, it appears that their interests broadly align, that there's been an abandonment of the working class and no interest in representing the interests of ordinary people, because there's too much at stake. The working class, whether it's in our country or yours, have been, broadly speaking, demonized, even when it comes to demonizing 50% of the population, as is the case with Brexit or Trump. And it doesn't seem that there's much traction around those issues. I wonder, when you consider your time working for the New York Times, particularly as a correspondent in Iraq, if you can see how the reporting on the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the left's position, and the reporting on the Iraq war and the position of the left, is perhaps an interesting meter to measure the movement.
So, I mean, it's hard for me to know, since I'm not in Ukraine firsthand, what the reporting is like, right? And there's that old saying, truth is the first casualty of war. I mean, I think things got really complicated in Iraq, both when I was there and after, because the American correspondents were under such direct threat from Islamist militants. Because, if you got captured, you were going to get put on a video with your head cut off, right? And so that forced people who didn't necessarily want to, to work closely with the U.S. military in a position where, to some extent, they had to embed if they wanted to see much of anything. So that was one issue in Iraq. In terms of Ukraine, it just seems like there's very, very little non-propaganda coming out from either side. I mean, it's very hard for independent journalists to embed with the Ukrainian military. It's certainly impossible for them to do that with the Russian military. So to some extent, we're dependent on these statements from the Ukrainian military, from the UK military, from the Pentagon, from Russia, and none of them are going to really tell the truth about what happens. I mean, you can count on that. And so, I think that's why I don't really consider myself qualified to tell you what is happening in Ukraine. I do think, in this, I'm not really on the sort of left side or the populist side. I think it's right for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. I think they are an independent country, and I think NATO has an interest in helping them defend themselves. So I know that's an unpopular position for many of my readers, but it's what I think. And I decided a long time ago that, I have this Substack, this Unreported Truth Substack, that I was going to tell people what I thought, even if they disagreed with me. And if they decided not to subscribe anymore, that would be their choice.
That's an interesting position in journalism these days. That word used to be known as integrity. Gareth hosts the show with me. What are you saying, Gal?
Hi, Alex. I just had a question of going back to Pfizer that we were talking about and Scott Gottlieb before. Because I thought what a really interesting element of that story was that the tweet that Gottlieb wanted flagged in the first place was by a former head of the FDA, which was kind of an amazing thing. And actually part of the tweet actually said that he encouraged people to go and get vaccinated, and yet it was still something that would sufficiently potentially harm Pfizer's vaccine sales. That ended up being flagged, even though it didn't violate any of the company's misinformation rules at the time. I just wondered, from your position now, what do you think the exposure of everything that's come through the Twitter files means for the future of the ability for government agencies to do this kind of thing? And, you mentioned about Fauci not having necessarily contact with Twitter. We know he definitely had contact with Facebook. Do you think that there'll be a change in the way that these kind of things are either handled or exposed in the future? And do you think it will be in a good way, or do you think that we're going to see even further crackdowns?
I mean, those are really good questions. I think that, from everything that I've seen, the federal government and the public health bureaucrats have learned entirely the wrong lesson of the last, in the last, let's say, 6 months, okay? The lesson they should have learned is that they overreached. They got a lot of people very angry. They hurt people's belief in sort of medicine in general, in childhood vaccines, which I think generally do work, although obviously, like everybody else, I'm questioning that more than I used to because of the massive failure of the mRNAs. And what they should have done, or what they should be doing right now, is looking at the reality of the fact that they made promises over the last 3 years, many, many promises that didn't come to fruition, right? I mean, essentially they said, if you follow us, if you lock down hard, if you take this vaccine, we're going to manage this in a way that it's not going to be a big, I mean, yes, society will be disrupted, but there won't be very many deaths, and we're going to come out of this in a good place. And that really hasn't happened. And that's why, fundamentally, why there's so much anger. It's not because of me or Joe Rogan or Russell. I mean, you guys, obviously, Russell, you have a huge audience, and Joe Rogan has a huge audience. But that's, we're not bigger than the entire, federal government and, international, intergovernmental organizations and the rest of the media. The reason people are skeptical right now is because they see with their own eyes that things have not gone as promised. And they know that 2 years ago, in the spring of 2021, they were told that we are very close to beating COVID thanks to the vaccines. And that hasn't happened. So unfortunately, what these bureaucrats and these politicians and even people like Brian Stelter are doing is saying, it's your fault, Berenson. It's your fault, Russell. You are, interfering with our narrative that everything is going to be perfect, or you're interfering with what we're trying to say, and you need to be silenced in some way. And it's stunning to me that there's this, when people say, I believe in the First Amendment, but that's the end. You either believe in the First Amendment or you don't. And these people no longer believe in the First Amendment. They no longer believe in free debate and free journalism. And that is very upsetting to me.
Contest that they never did, but there was never a situation before where it was as relevant as it is now, where the means of communication has become truly democratized because of technological advancement. Just a side note, apparently Anthony Fauci's daughter works at Twitter, so there's at least one tangential and genetic connection to that social media platform. Hey, Alex, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your great work over the years, and more latterly. Alex Berenson can be found on Substack, where he will tell you the truth as he sees it, even if it will potentially irritate you. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Russell, thank you so much for having me.
It's a joy to speak with you. I hope we get to speak again soon. Thanks so much, Alex. Take care, mate.